March 23, 1945, midnight on the western bank of the Rhine. Rain drizzled in cold sheets across the flooded farmland. Mud clung to boots. The air reeked of diesel, gun oil, and the coppery scent of blood buried under weeks of shell fire. On the far side of the river, the German 1st Parachute Army waited with machine guns trained across the black water. Spotlights scanned the darkness. The last intact crossings had been destroyed days ago. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen collapsed. They believed no American force could get across here. Not now, not with the river this high and the artillery so thick. Then came a sound that didn't belong. At first, Feldwebel Gunther Wolf thought it was wind through the broken tree line. A faint metallic clanking, almost rhythmic. He leaned forward, binoculars up, scanning the shore. Then he saw it. Not boats, not pontoons, girders, steel plates, bulldozers and cranes hauled across floating platforms. Spotlights flickered on the American side, shrouded in fog. Engineers in soaked uniforms moved like ants around a hive. They were building a bridge. Right there. Under fire. In the open. At night. And it was working. Gunther's breath caught in his throat. "Unmöglich," he whispered. It wasn't impossible, it was American. The bridge wasn't beautiful, it wasn't supposed to be. It was slabs of steel, latticework slammed together with rivets and acetylene torches. But it grew, inch by inch, plank by plank. Every 15 minutes it extended further out into the current. And all the while shells rained down. German artillery from the far bank thundered across the river. Explosions rocked the shoreline. Dirt and flame erupted around the engineers, but they did not stop. Some were blown off the deck and replaced within minutes. Others dragged bodies aside and kept hammering. Behind the ridge, 1,000 tanks, half-tracks, and infantry vehicles waited like predators behind a steel gate. The Germans didn't see it yet, but they were watching their own trapdoor open. Captain Thomas Ridgway of the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion hadn't slept in 36 hours. His face was caked in dried mud, his voice hoarse from shouting over bulldozers and artillery. But the bridge was his now, and the river wasn't going to win. "Get those panels locked," he barked, waving his grease pencil clipboard. "I want the Bailey trusses spliced and dropped every 10 minutes, not 11, not 12, 10. His men moved like machines, not flawless but relentless. The kind of efficiency you couldn't train for, you just had to survive long enough to develop it. They were teenagers from Iowa, steelworkers from Pittsburgh, farmhands from Georgia, and they were throwing steel across the Rhine under direct fire. Ridgway looked up at the blinking red horizon. He knew what crossed this bridge wouldn't be trucks or medics. It would be Patton's armor. By 100 hours, the first segment reached deep enough into the current to drift on pontoons. The engineers hammered it down, tied cables into knots tighter than fear. Spotters called out artillery trajectories. Cranes slid beams into place like bones into a spine. A German 88 cracked through the air. A pontoon burst. Water swallowed one corner of the structure. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Ridgway shouted, "Replace it, bolt it down. If it sinks, we walk across bodies instead." Nobody argued. Corporal Eugen Metz of the 11th Panzer Grenadier Regiment stared through a rangefinder from the second-story window of a ruined farmhouse. Rain streaked the glass. The bridge was halfway across the river now. "Sir, they're not stopping." His officer looked through the lens, then set it down slowly. "They're not supposed to. They're Americans." He didn't say it with hatred. He said it with disbelief. By 200, German machine gun teams tried to suppress the construction, raking the near shore with fire. American .50 cals answered, mowing down hedgerows, ripping into German positions across the way. The sound was thunder and metal and screaming steel. Still, the bridge advanced. On the west bank, behind a camouflaged rise, the 9th Armored Division waited with engines running. General Walton Walker stood beside his jeep, peering through field glasses. "How long?" he asked the sapper beside him. "Another hour, maybe two." Walker nodded. "We'll give them one." By 3:45, the lead tank rolled forward. An M4A3 Sherman, coated in grime, engine snarling like a beast too long caged. The crew didn't speak. The bridge groaned beneath their treads. Water slapped against the pontoons. A spotter on the far shore radioed the coordinates. The German artillery zeroed in. Shells exploded on either side of the span. Shrapnel tore into the air. And still the Sherman crossed. Gunther Wolf stared through his scope, mouth dry. "There, they're sending armor." "Through that," Metz said, "it won't hold." But it did. One tank, then 3, then 20. By dawn, the Americans had a bridge. By mid-morning, they had a beachhead. By nightfall, they had punched a hole into Germany itself. The bridge never had a name. It didn't need one. It wasn't for glory or headlines. It was a steel artery in the American war machine, built in darkness and blood. And to the Germans, it defied every rule of war they thought they understood. No rest. No delay. No waiting for the guns to fall silent. They built while under fire. And they crossed while still bleeding. It would not be the last bridge. But it was the first that proved to the Wehrmacht that the river no longer protected them. Steel could float. Fire couldn't stop it. And by the time they realized it, the Americans were already across. By the time the sun crested the tree line, steam rose from the river like breath off the back of a beast. The steel bridge that hadn't existed 12 hours ago now stretched across the Rhine in a shape that made no architectural sense. A Frankenstein of Bailey panels, prefabricated trusses, and sandbagged pontoons. But it held. That was all that mattered. American tanks rolled east in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Armored columns, jeeps, ammo trucks, artillery towed on half-tracks. Everything passed over the jigsaw miracle built under shell fire, and it didn't buckle. Captain Thomas Ridgway stood at the midpoint of the span, watching the armored train of war pass by, his boots still caked in blood and concrete dust. He hadn't taken his helmet off. He hadn't even eaten. The bridge had cost 6 lives in 5 hours. He lit a cigarette with a trembling hand and stared at the opposite bank. Somewhere out there, German forward observers were watching this whole thing, and they weren't moving. Not yet. But they would. The Rhine was no longer a river. It was a fuse. 10 miles east, Oberleutnant Rolf Kehl of the 11th Panzer Division stood in a fog-covered orchard with a radio pressed to his ear. Intercepts from the front were coming faster now. Bridgeheads confirmed. Armor moving inland. Artillery repositioning west of the town of Wessel. His commanding officer, Hauptmann Schäfer, stepped out of a dugout, soaked and unshaven. They crossed. Kehl nodded grimly. "Yes, the bridge is real, it's not temporary. First armor passed before sunrise. Infantry followed, and they're reinforcing." There was a pause. The orchard was quiet but for the wind. Schäfer didn't curse. He didn't shout. He just exhaled and said, "Then we've lost the river." It wasn't panic, it was worse. It was the sound of certainty. The German defense had gambled that the Rhine would hold, that the crossings would be choked, that engineers would need days under fire to move a single column east. But now, with Patton's armor crossing a bridge that hadn't existed yesterday, the timetable was shattered. A panzer officer's war was supposed to be maneuver, counterattack, delay, strike. Not this. Not bridges appearing out of darkness like nightmares made of rivets. Back at the river's edge, Sergeant Manny Alvarez was elbow-deep in wet cable, trying to reinforce a pontoon anchor that had started to shift under the weight of 3 M10 tank destroyers. "Get me more cable," he shouted, slipping on the slick deck plates. Private DuPont appeared with a coil slung over his shoulder. "This thing's groaning like it's alive," he muttered, kneeling beside him. Alvarez grinned. "It is alive, just a pissed-off iron skeleton with artillery screaming at it." The two men lashed down the pontoon, secured it with steel hammers, and slid out of the way as another wave of trucks came barreling across. There was no pause, no breathing room. Every man in the 291st Engineer Battalion knew the deal. Once the bridge started taking traffic, it could not stop. Not until the last battalion crossed, the last Sherman rolled, and the last howitzer was in position. Every hour, every minute of flow was a heartbeat. If it stopped, the artery clotted. And if the artery clotted, the war stalled. German counter-battery fire intensified after noon. Shells came in pairs, then salvos. A direct hit collapsed the northbound fuel supply truck. Black smoke towered up into the sky, but traffic didn't stop. The corpses were dragged aside. The gap filled with another truck within seconds. The engineers didn't react with shock anymore. It was all muscle memory. One crew section poured quickset concrete into shell divots on the decking, while another laid steel grating on top, and a third secured pontoons with emergency rebar. Captain Ridgway sprinted down the causeway, ignoring the explosions. "Check lateral tension on the eastern span. I want scaffolding redone in 10 minutes, or it'll shear under the next M26. Behind him, the bridge creaked, but didn't snap. In the field command post outside the German town of Meyrug, Generalleutnant Albert Schack paced beside a map peppered with red wax pencil. His intelligence officer stood beside him, pale. "They've built 3 bridges now," the officer said quietly. "The 291st at Wessel, another at Oppenheim, 3rd at Boppard, all under fire, all carrying armor." Schack looked up slowly. "Bailey bridges." "Yes, sir." "And what do we have in place to stop them?" There was silence. "Sir, we blew every crossing. We held the river. They brought their own crossings." That night, a Luftwaffe recon pilot flew low over the Rhine at 3,000 feet. Through scattered flak and tracer fire, he spotted what he thought were artillery pieces moving along the western edge of the water. He banked, came around again, and realized with disbelief what he was seeing. Bridges. Multiple. Lit by floodlights, crawling with vehicles, swarmed by infantry. He snapped 2 photos before flak stitched his wing and forced him to break away. When he landed, bleeding from the forehead, he handed the camera to the intelligence chief and said, "They're not crossing the Rhine. They've conquered it." On the far bank, deep into the German countryside, the lead elements of the 9th Armored rolled past empty villages and bombed out rail lines. They didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. Because back at the river, the engineers were still building. Each hour, the bridge grew stronger. Each round of artillery made it tougher. The Germans had expected engineers to retreat under fire. Instead, they adapted. They swapped timber for steel. They set pontoons deeper. They built in 3s, one under construction, one under traffic, one waiting as backup. And the American divisions behind them kept flowing. At midnight, Oberleutnant Kale stood in the orchard again, staring west. He could see the lights now, not campfires, not burning wrecks, but electric light flooding from the American positions. Engineers with generators, arc welders, construction lamps. He turned to Scheffer and said, "They don't even hide anymore." Scheffer looked through binoculars and didn't answer. Because how do you hide a miracle made of iron and blood? The next day, radio intercepts confirmed the unimaginable. Patton's Third Army was pushing east ahead of schedule. Not because the enemy had collapsed. Not because of luck. Because engineers had dragged rivers out of the way like ropes in the dirt. By the end of the week, the Americans had crossed the Rhine in 5 separate locations. The Germans still held towns, still held hills, still had tanks, but the river was no longer a barrier. It was a memory. And behind every armored spearhead, every infantry company, every artillery brigade, somewhere in the smoke was a combat engineer holding a wrench, his hands black with grease, his boots still wet from the river, and a bridge behind him that hadn't existed the night before. 3 days after the bridge at Wesel opened, there were 5 more, each one different, some floating on pontoon strings, some fixed to reinforced abutments, some reinforced with Bailey trusses scavenged from depots 20 miles away. It didn't matter what they were made of, only that they worked. And they all did. On the morning of March 26th, a reconnaissance group from the German 116th Panzer Division attempted a feint near the town of Hamminkelm. They expected engineers, soft units, unarmored, slow to react. What they found instead was a coordinated box of overlapping .50 caliber positions, manned by men in muddy uniforms with bridge grease still on their fingers, who fired with cold precision the moment German silhouettes broke the tree line. The engineers had stopped being support. They were the front line now. Corporal Manny Alvarez chewed on a piece of hardtack while tightening bolts on the bridge apron. His uniform stank of diesel, and one of his boots had dried blood caked around the sole. "You hear that?" Private Dupont asked, crouched beside him. "Engines," Alvarez muttered. "M26s, they'll want to cross by noon. They're not gonna wait if we're not done. They never do." The sound grew louder. American armor. The Pershings had arrived. Heavy tanks meant stress loads would double, and the bridge had to bear it. No time, no pause, just bolts and braces, sledgehammers in gloved fists. Behind them, an entire corps waited. The pressure never lifted. Across the river, German infantry sat in shell holes, cold and wet, watching with binoculars. One private turned to his lieutenant and asked, "Why don't they stop?" The officer didn't answer, because that question no longer had meaning. The engineers built in rhythm, eat in shifts, sleep in rotation, repair between crossings. Everything else, nerves, fear, artillery, became background noise. The Americans didn't wait for rivers to recede or storms to pass. They built bridges while the world was still on fire. And Germany had no answer for it. On the night of March 27th, Lieutenant Ken Franklin of the 289th Engineer Combat Battalion stood in the middle of his second completed bridge and looked up at the sky. The stars were out. It had stopped raining. He hadn't realized that until just now. One of his men approached, saluted loosely, and handed over a report. The night's column was complete. 47 vehicles, 3 tank platoons, 2 companies of infantry, a mobile artillery unit, and 2 fuel trucks. All had crossed. The bridge had held. Franklin stared at the stars a second longer and then said aloud, "2 more by morning." The private blinked. "Sir, we build 2 more, east crossings, wider, deeper. The Germans are falling back faster than we thought. We don't wait." The man didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and vanished into the dark. Because this was how it worked now. Bridges didn't take days, they took hours. And the men who built them were no longer just engineers. They were accelerants. German High Command received reconnaissance updates with growing disbelief. Their maps couldn't keep up. Whole divisions were appearing where rivers should have been obstacles. Towns that were supposed to be safe for a week were falling in hours. "Are they flying across?" one colonel muttered. "No," a junior officer replied, voice flat. "They're walking across bridges they built last night." In a field hospital west of Wesel, an injured German artilleryman whispered to a nurse, "I saw one go up in the moonlight. It wasn't even dark yet. It looked like a goddamned cathedral made of steel." The nurse didn't respond. She simply changed his bandages and tried not to picture what that must have looked like. By the end of March, 20 Allied divisions had crossed the Rhine. Infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, supply convoys, all flowing over a spiderweb of bridges that hadn't existed 2 weeks prior. German resistance grew more erratic, fierce in pockets but unable to hold. Every time a river was expected to stall the advance, it didn't. By April, it became a pattern. Not where will the Americans cross, but how fast will they build the bridge? Outside the ruined village of Vilatho, the 291st Combat Engineers completed a full-span Bailey Bridge across the Weser in 10 hours. It had been planned for 3 days. The Germans had pre-sighted it for artillery. The Americans beat the timetable by 2.5 days. The guns fired too late. Tanks were already across. At a Luftwaffe briefing, a pilot stood up and said, "We can't bomb the bridges. We can't even find them fast enough." "Why?" the commander asked. The pilot looked down at his boots. "Because they're not there during recon." Sergeant Alvarez slammed a final bolt into place just as the first jeep revved onto the span. His arms ached. His uniform was soaked through. His boots had holes in both soles. He grinned. "We're getting good at this," he said to no one in particular. Then he picked up a wrench and walked to the next section. To the Germans, it seemed like a kind of dark magic. These bridges appeared from mist and fire, crossing rivers in silence, holding under impossible loads, vanishing when no longer needed. But it wasn't magic. It was steel. It was sweat. It was the refusal to stop. The smell of acetylene torchwork never left the air. Burned oil, scorched rubber, cordite. It lingered across the Rhine and all the way east into Lower Saxony, where American forward units began reporting that roads ahead were too narrow or broken for armor to move without delay. Delay was not an option. The orders were the same in every engineer battalion's ear: keep moving, keep crossing, keep building. Rivers, creeks, ravines, anything wide enough to slow the tracks of a Sherman or the wheels of a supply truck had to be made passable. Not tomorrow, not by the book, tonight. In a field 2 kilometers outside of Warburg, Sergeant Manny Alvarez stood knee-deep in marsh water beneath a fallen timber bridge that had collapsed under the weight of a half-track 4 hours earlier. Above him, torchlight flickered on soaked steel beams. His squad moved in rhythm now. They didn't speak unless they had to. The rain had returned and they worked through it. "Steel's rusting through," DuPont called down. "We're cutting through and laying lattice on top. Should take the weight." 5 tons, Alvarez asked. 8 if you don't ask questions. Good. They were 40 minutes into the build. The first M10 tank destroyer was already idling nearby. No one asked why they had to work so fast anymore. Everyone understood. If the engineers stopped, so did the war, and the Americans were not in the mood to slow down. They were driving deep into Germany now, past rivers that no longer mattered, past towns where resistance was fanatical but isolated, past German roadblocks that assumed they had time to prepare. Time had been stolen by engineers with hammers and steel. On the other side of the ruined village of Warburg, Oberleutnant Kale stood with a radio operator beneath a makeshift shelter of broken timbers. His battalion was down to 70 men, most of them wounded. They were supposed to defend the northern approach into the Harz Mountains. They had counted on the bridge being out. The map said it was out. Aerial reconnaissance showed no construction, no equipment, no armor within 20 kilometers. But as the sun rose and the fog burned off the fields, Kale saw the first Pershing tank crest the road and roll forward. Then another. Then 6. Behind them came trucks, artillery, infantry. A convoy, moving without pause. "What is that?" the radio operator whispered. Kale answered without looking. "A bridge they built in the dark." Back in the American column, Lieutenant Franklin leaned out of a jeep window, his uniform soaked, eyes red. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, hadn't eaten anything but a can of beans last night while sitting on a toolbox. But the bridge was behind them. It had held. The engineers had laid it across a creek swollen to double its normal width. They de-scouted it, sketched it, sourced it, and built it between 2300 and 340 hours, using repurposed lumber from a collapsed barn and latticework cut from decommissioned Bailey spans. The design wasn't standard, it wasn't pretty, it wasn't even safe by Corps standards. But it worked. "You ever think," said the driver beside him, "we'd be building bridges for tanks under artillery fire with no goddamn sleep?" Franklin just smiled. "Yeah, in hell." Near Cassel, American divisions encountered the Fulda River, a wide, twisting stretch of water too deep to ford and too fast for temporary raft crossings. German demolition crews had destroyed every standing structure across it 2 days earlier. But the Americans didn't slow down. They had already begun dropping prefabricated Bailey components by glider behind the next ridgeline. Engineer companies moved up through the trees before the rest of the army even got within sight of the river. By the time the first German artillery spotted the Americans, they weren't standing on the shore with tape measures. They were halfway across. German commanders cursed the reports. They had blown the bridges. The river was supposed to be a choke point. They'd done everything right. But it wasn't about the bridges anymore. It was about the builders. By April 3rd, elements of the 83rd Infantry Division had crossed 3 rivers in 72 hours without slowing. Reports came in from the German rear lines of entire towns falling before counterattacks could even form. The Wehrmacht's map of impassable terrain was obsolete before the ink dried. In one intercepted transmission, a German major shouted into his radio, "They don't follow the roads, they don't follow the rules, they build the roads as they go." In the American Forward Command tent outside Göttingen, General Bradley reviewed the day's situation report and underlined one note twice in red pencil. "Bridge across the lane constructed in 5 hours under light artillery, minimal loss, 100% structural integrity, first armor across 405 hours. He nodded once and circled it again, then turned the page. It was just one of dozens that day. Back near the lane, Alvarez and DuPont sat beside the temporary ramp they just reinforced, leaning against a support beam still warm from friction. Rain hit the canvas overhead, but not hard. They passed a can of lukewarm coffee between them and watched as another tank passed onto the bridge they just finished. "You ever think," DuPont asked again, "they'll write stories about guys like us?" Alvarez didn't answer. He just raised the coffee in a silent toast and watched the armor roll across. 1,000 meters away in the woods beyond the river, a group of German soldiers watched from cover, binoculars shaking in one man's hand. A field telephone crackled. "The Americans just crossed the lane," someone said on the line. But the bridge was destroyed. "They built another one." Another silence. "Then they're not men, they're machines." They weren't machines. They were tired, hungry, cold, angry Americans with grease-streaked faces and a habit of building bridges where there weren't supposed to be any. They didn't wait for the enemy to surrender. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't stop. And every time Germany believed it had bought itself a day's delay, the engineers proved them wrong. By April 10th, the Allies had crossed more rivers than the German general staff had even charted as military obstacles. The Elbe, the Weser, the Saale, the Mulde, names that once held strategic weight were now just landmarks on a map being redrawn in real time by tanks, trucks, and engineers with steel beams on their backs. In the town of Bernburg, German troops waited in trenches that faced nothing but open fields. No tanks, no artillery, no infantry, just a cold river that curved through the valley like a serpent. Their orders were simple: hold the crossing, deny it for 72 hours, buy time for the withdrawal to the Haar's line. They believed they had at least a day. But when dawn broke, the horizon gleamed with floodlights. The air was thick with the growl of machinery, not tanks, not artillery. Generators, welding torches, winches. They were already building. By the time the first German shell dropped into the river's edge, the American engineers were 50 meters into the water, anchoring pontoon cables and setting pre-assembled spans into place with cranes mounted on tracked chassis. On the bank above, a rifle platoon formed a perimeter with sandbags and .50 caliber Brownings. The engineers worked behind them, heads down, silent but fast. They didn't look like soldiers anymore. They looked like dockworkers at war. A German forward observer watched through a scope and blinked in disbelief. "They've been here all night," he whispered. "We didn't see them." He turned to his radio man. "They built a bridge while we were sleeping." In the American command tent near the staging area, Lieutenant Franklin finished reading the overnight sitrep and crossed out the phrase, "expected contact by 1400. Contact would come sooner, but it wouldn't stop anything. Orders came in. One more bridge east of the last crossing, no road access, no support, just a ravine and a stream swollen by spring runoff. Franklin gathered his men. "We go now. 2 hours full span ready for light armor. We don't wait for artillery clearance." A few groaned, one coughed, no one objected. They moved like a company born of steel and sleep deprivation. By the time the sun hit its peak, the crossing was complete. By the time the first German patrol reached the opposite bank, it was already too late. The Americans were across. Again. A Wehrmacht staff officer on the retreating side of the Elbe asked aloud, "Why do they never rest?" His aide, a young conscript with frostbitten fingers, answered without sarcasm, "Because they know we need them to." No one laughed, not anymore. In town after town, the Germans had watched American armor appear where no vehicles should have been able to go. In terrain blocked by rivers, gorges, swamps, and always the same explanation: a bridge. Not a bridge that had existed. A bridge that had been willed into existence, built under fire, across silence, through exhaustion, with hands that never stopped working. Outside the ruins of Magdeburg, German engineers found the remains of an American crossing built entirely from scavenged steel from destroyed German railcars, riveted by hand, unpainted, unlabeled. And it had held long enough to get a division across. One of the Germans knelt beside it and ran a hand across the weld seams. He whispered, "This is not improvisation, this is doctrine." By April 25th, the 69th Infantry Division met Soviet forces at the Elbe. The war in Europe was functionally over. But it hadn't been won only with tanks or bombers or bullets. It had been won across planks, beams, pontoons, and Bailey spans. It had been carried over rivers on the backs of men who built steel roads while mortars fell around them. In the weeks that followed, German prisoners were processed by the hundreds, some silent, some hostile, but many asked the same question when they saw how quickly the Allies had moved. "How did you cross so fast?" Some were told about the bridges. Most didn't believe it. They thought it was propaganda. They hadn't seen men hammering girders under moonlight with shells bursting 100 meters away. They hadn't seen teenagers wading waist-deep into freezing rivers to weld plate onto swaying decks. They hadn't seen the look in the eyes of a combat engineer at the end of a night where 6 had died and 200 tanks had crossed anyway. But those who had, they knew. They knew what America had unleashed wasn't just manpower or machines. It was a kind of inevitability. Every time the Germans thought they had drawn a line, the engineers erased it. Every obstacle became a passage. Every river a runway. Every delay a myth. In a letter sent home after the war, A captain of the 291st wrote, "We built them while the sky fell. We crossed them while the world burned. And by the time the enemy looked up, we were already behind them." The Germans had planned to use rivers as walls. The Americans used them as paths. And the engineers made it happen. Overnight, under fire,